Her billionaire husband gave his mistress his wife's black card. She froze it before the gala. If your spouse handed your private black card to someone else, what would you do? Let us see how it unfolded. The first sign that Charles Wellington had given his mistress more than attention appeared on Aaliyah's phone as an $85,000 charge from a boutique she had never entered. Dr. Aaliyah Monroe Wellington was seated at the end of a walnut conference table overlooking Manhattan when the alert appeared beneath a quarterly investment report. Around her, 6 advisors discussed market exposure, charitable allocations, and the final guest list for Saturday's Wellington Foundation Gala. Aaliyah barely moved. Her thumb rested against the screen while the merchant name glowed beneath the amount. Bellamy Couture, Madison Avenue. The black card ending in 0808 had been issued through Monroe Family Office, an account reserved for private acquisitions, emergency travel, and foundation commitments requiring immediate discretion. It had never left the locked compartment inside her dressing room. At least, that was what Aaliyah had believed. Dr. Monroe, her chief financial officer, asked, "Should we continue?" She lifted her eyes. Yes. Her voice remained smooth enough that no one noticed the chill moving beneath her skin. She listened while the room discussed a $5 million grant, but another notification appeared before the meeting ended. $12,400 at Beaumont Jewelers. Then $6,800 at Maison Elon for shoes, alterations, and private styling. Every charge carried the same card number. Aaliyah closed the report and excused herself without explanation. In the marble hallway, she called the private banking line printed on the back of her digital wallet. "This is Dr. Aaliyah Monroe Wellington," she said. "I need verification on 3 transactions made this afternoon." The representative asked 2 security questions, then lowered his voice. "The purchases were made in person, ma'am." "By whom?" The merchant submitted identification for Madeline Cross. The name landed quietly. Madeline was Charles's communications director, the woman who had begun attending dinners Aaliyah was told were too confidential for spouses. She was 34, blonde, polished, and always careful to touch Charles's sleeve only when a camera could mistake it for professional familiarity. "Madeline Cross is not authorized on my account," Aaliyah said. "I understand. However, a temporary spending authorization was added yesterday." Aaliyah stood still beside a window overlooking Fifth Avenue. "Added by whom?" The representative hesitated. Mr. Charles Wellington called from his verified number. The city below continued moving as if nothing had changed. Taxis slid through traffic. Pedestrians crossed beneath the late afternoon sun. Somewhere 3 blocks away, Madeline was trying on a gown purchased with Aaliyah's money for a gala built under Aaliyah's foundation. "What did he tell you?" Aaliyah asked. "He identified Ms. Cross as a household representative." "That is not what I asked." Silence held for a moment. Then the banker answered carefully. He referred to her as his wife. Aaliyah's breath remained steady, but her hand tightened around the phone. Charles had been careless before. He had arrived home after midnight with explanations that sounded rehearsed. He had changed passwords, dismissed questions, and suggested that Aaliyah's work made her suspicious. But this was different. This was documented. This was her husband using her account, her name, and her authority to dress another woman for a public event where donors believed Aaliyah and Charles still represented unity. "Please email me the authorization record," she said. "And do not contact Mr. Wellington. Would you like the card suspended?" Aaliyah looked through the glass toward the skyline. Then imagined Madeline standing beneath boutique lights while a stylist fastened an $85,000 gown around her. "Not yet," she replied. "First, tell me every reservation connected to that card." The banker began reading. A hotel suite, a chauffeured car, a private jewelry delivery, and a gala styling team scheduled to arrive at 6. Aaliyah listened to each detail. Then she opened the Wellington Foundation guest list and found that Madeline's name had been moved into the seat beside Charles, while Aaliyah's had disappeared completely. Charles had not merely handed Madeline the black card. He had handed her Aaliyah's place in the world and expected no one to question the substitution. The authorization record arrived in Aaliyah's inbox 6 minutes after she left the conference room. She opened it inside her private office, where the walls held photographs of medical missions, foundation grants, and the first investment portfolio she built before Charles Wellington's name appeared on any billionaire list. The document was brief. Charles had called the bank at 9:14 the previous morning, answered every security question correctly, and requested temporary access for Madeline Cross through the end of the gala weekend. Beneath the transcript, one sentence had been highlighted by the compliance officer. My wife will be handling our household and event purchases. Please make sure she is not inconvenienced. Aaliyah read the line without blinking. Charles knew whose account it was. He knew the black card existed because Monroe family office had permitted him limited travel privileges after their marriage, but he had never been the primary holder. The credit limit came from Aaliyah's private assets, not Wellington Capital. Every concierge service, luxury reservation, and emergency purchase connected to that card answered to her signature alone. Yet Charles had spoken to the bank as if her identity were transferable. Her phone lit up with a photograph from the foundation's event planner. Madeline stood on a mirrored platform at Bellamy Couture, wearing a black beaded gown that swept around her like liquid smoke. The caption read, "Mrs. Wellington's final fitting is complete. Stunning choice for Saturday." Aaliyah studied the image. Madeline's smile was not tentative. It was the smile of a woman who believed the room had already accepted her. A second photograph showed diamond earrings displayed beside the gown. A third showed Charles's assistant approving a chauffeured Bentley and a penthouse suite at the St. Regis for Mr. Wellington and guest. Aaliyah called the event planner. "This is Dr. Aaliyah Monroe Wellington." The woman on the other end went quiet. "Dr. Monroe, I was just about to contact you. You sent me a photograph addressed to Mrs. Wellington. I apologize. Mr. Wellington's office told us Ms. Cross would be representing the family this year, and my name was removed from the table. We received a revised seating chart this morning." Aaliyah turned toward the windows. Manhattan glittered beneath the approaching evening, polished and indifferent. Who approved the revision? Mr. Wellington personally. There it was again. Not a mistake. Not a misunderstanding. A sequence of deliberate choices. Charles had given Madeline Aaliyah's card, her seat, her title, and the public role she had spent 12 years building beside him. "Do not change anything yet," Aaliyah said. "And please keep this conversation confidential." After the call, she opened the foundation's governance documents. The gala was publicly branded under the Wellington name, but the event itself was financed through the Monroe Legacy Fund, the charitable trust Aaliyah inherited from her grandmother. Charles served as honorary co-chair. Aaliyah controlled the board, the donor account, and every binding contract. He had forgotten that the glamorous evening he used to impress investors existed only because she had funded it. At 7, Charles called. His voice sounded casual, almost affectionate. "I heard you spoke with the planner." "I did. There has been a change for Saturday." "So I noticed." He exhaled with practiced impatience. "Madeline understands the new donors better. She will sit with me and handle the public side of the event." Aaliyah let the silence stretch. "Using my card? It is a household account. It is my private account. Aaliyah, do not turn this into a scene." Madeline needed a gown, transportation, and appropriate jewelry. It was efficient. "You called her your wife." Charles paused for half a second, then recovered. "The bank representative misunderstood me." The call was recorded. This time, the silence belonged to him. When he finally spoke, his tone had hardened. "We will discuss it at home." The call ended. Aaliyah opened the banking dashboard and reviewed the controls attached to the black card. One command could freeze the card instantly. Another could cancel every reservation connected to it. She did neither. Instead, she scheduled the freeze for 5:45 p.m. on Gala night, 15 minutes before Madeline's final jewelry balance, hotel deposit, and chauffeured car were due to process. Then Aaliyah opened the Gala's master ownership file and confirmed the detail Charles had never bothered to remember. Every contract, every table, and every dollar in the room belonged to her foundation, and his name appeared nowhere as an owner. Charles did not ask Aaliyah to stay away from the gala. He informed her as if the woman who funded the evening needed permission to enter it. He arrived home just after 9, carrying the cold confidence of a man who had already rehearsed the conversation in the elevator. Their penthouse was quiet except for the soft hum of the city beyond the windows. Aaliyah stood near the dining table in a slate blue dress, reviewing foundation reports beneath a pendant light. She had placed the printed bank authorization beside her untouched tea. Charles saw it immediately. His gaze paused on the highlighted sentence where he had called Madeline his wife, then moved to Aaliyah's face. You contacted the bank, he said. It is my account. You could have called me first. Before asking why my husband gave another woman my black card, Charles removed his jacket and draped it over a chair. Madeline needed to look appropriate for the gala. Her department has been working for months to attract younger donors. So you gave her $85,000 for a dress. The card has no practical limit. Neither does disrespect, apparently. He looked at her with the familiar expression he used in boardrooms when someone challenged him publicly. This is exactly why I did not involve you. You make every operational decision emotional. Aaliyah's fingers rested beside the bank transcript. You told them she was your wife. I used shorthand so the authorization would move faster. You used my identity. Charles exhaled sharply and walked toward the windows. Below them, headlights moved along Park Avenue in bright, orderly lines. Saturday matters, he said. Wellington Capital is closing 2 major partnerships. The gala needs energy, visibility, and someone willing to engage the press. Aaliyah watched his reflection in the glass. Someone like Madeline. She understands the image we need. And what image is that? He turned. A united front. The hypocrisy was so cleanly delivered that Aaliyah almost admired it. With your mistress sitting in my chair? Charles's face tightened, but he did not deny the word. Lower your voice. There is no one else here. Then stop performing. Aaliyah looked at the place setting across from her, remembering how many dinners had gone cold while Charles stayed late with Madeline. How long, she asked. This is not the time. How long have you been sleeping beside one woman while using the other woman's money to dress her? His silence answered before his mouth did. 6 months, he finally said. The room seemed to lose temperature. Aaliyah had suspected betrayal, but suspicion still left room for mercy. A number did not. 6 months meant birthdays, foundation meetings, weekend trips, and every night Charles returned home with some version of exhaustion in his voice. Saturday cannot become a scandal, he continued. Madeline will accompany me. You should take the weekend away. Aaliyah looked at him slowly. You are asking me not to attend my own foundation's gala. Publicly, it is the Wellington Foundation. Publicly, she repeated. Charles mistook her calm for surrender. He moved closer and lowered his voice. After the gala, we can discuss a separation discreetly. I will make sure you are comfortable. Comfortable. You will keep the apartment, a generous settlement, and your charitable work. There is no reason to damage either of our reputations. He spoke as though he were dividing assets he owned. Aaliyah felt something inside her grow still. Not broken. Finished. She gathered the bank transcript and foundation reports into a leather folder. Madeline will represent the Wellington family, Charles said, giving the final instruction. Do not come to the gala. Aaliyah met his eyes. Then she should be prepared to pay for the privilege. He frowned. What is that supposed to mean? Nothing you need to worry about tonight. She left him standing beneath the city lights and entered her private study. At 10:02 p.m., she called the president of Monroe family office and instructed him to remove Charles from every auxiliary account by gala morning. Then she opened the foundation bylaws and activated an emergency chair provision that allowed her to revise the program without notifying the honorary co-chair. Before closing her laptop, she added one final item to the gala schedule, a live announcement identifying the foundation's sole legal owner, controlling donor, and permanent chair. By Saturday afternoon, Madeline believed the black card had purchased her a place beside Charles, but Aaliyah had already decided exactly when that illusion would expire. The gala was scheduled for 7 at the Metropolitan Grand, a limestone hotel overlooking Central Park where the Monroe Legacy Fund had hosted its annual benefit for nearly a decade. By 3, the ballroom glowed beneath suspended crystal lights, florists arranged white roses along the staircase, and servers polished rows of champagne glasses beneath a gold foundation crest. Madeline arrived at the St. Regis suite Charles had reserved with Aaliyah's card, carrying garment bags from Bellamy Couture and jewelry boxes sealed with ivory ribbon. She moved through the room with the confidence of someone rehearsing a new identity. Her gown waited near the window. The $85,000 black beading caught the afternoon light. On the dresser sat diamond earrings from Beaumont Jewelers, approved for final purchase at 5:45. A chauffeur was scheduled downstairs at 6. Charles had promised photographers would see them enter together. Across town, Aaliyah sat inside Monroe family office with her private banker, Naomi Ellis, and the foundation's general counsel. She wore a white silk blouse beneath a midnight blue suit, her hair swept into a low, elegant twist. On the table before her lay the black card controls, the Gala contracts, and a list of every reservation Charles had attached to her account. Once we freeze the card, Naomi said, the pending jewelry balance will fail. The hotel will request a replacement card. The car service will cancel if payment is not received within 10 minutes. And the styling team? Aaliyah asked. Their deposit already cleared, but the remaining balance processes at 5:50. Aaliyah glanced at the clock. 5:42. Leave the gown untouched, she said. The boutique delivered it under an approved transaction. Everything still pending should stop. The attorney looked at her. You could cancel the gala itself. No, Aaliyah's voice stayed calm. The donors, staff, and beneficiaries did nothing wrong. The event continues. At 5:45 precisely, Naomi rotated the laptop toward her. One button waited beneath the account number ending in 0808. Aaliyah pressed it. The card changed from active to frozen. Then she removed Charles's auxiliary access, canceled the hotel guarantee, revoked the concierge profile, and placed a compliance hold on every new charge. No raised voice. No warning. Just 4 quiet confirmations appearing one after another on the screen. At the St. Regis, Madeline stood before the mirror while a stylist adjusted the gown at her waist. Her phone rang. Beaumont Jewelers. Ms. Cross, the final payment was declined, the associate said. We need another card before releasing the earrings. Madeline frowned. Run it again. We already have. A second call arrived from the front desk. The penthouse authorization had been withdrawn, and the hotel required a personal card for the room, minibar, and incidentals. Before she could answer, the chauffeur service sent a cancellation notice. Then the styling director stepped into the suite, holding a tablet. I'm sorry, Ms. Cross, but the remaining balance did not process. Madeline stared at the black card on the vanity. It looked exactly as powerful as it had an hour earlier. There must be a bank error. She called Charles. He answered on the first ring, already dressed in a tuxedo at his office. The card is frozen, she said. Fix it. Aaliyah must have done something. You said she would not interfere. I'll call the bank. He did, but the private banking desk refused to discuss the account. He called the hotel next. They required payment from him directly. His corporate card covered the suite, but the car, jewelry, and styling package pushed the total beyond its temporary event limit. Use your own card, he told Madeline. Her silence lasted too long. Madeline, I did not bring one with enough available credit. Charles closed his eyes. For the first time, the scale of what he had promised her became visible without Aaliyah's money beneath it. At 6:12, Aaliyah entered the Metropolitan Grand through the foundation entrance. The event director greeted her as sole chair and handed her the revised program. Charles and Madeline were still listed for the opening procession, exactly as they expected. Aaliyah did not remove their names. Instead, she added a notation beside the donor address, ownership and governance announcement to follow. Then Naomi approached with one final update. Charles had tried to restore the card through an emergency executive contact, claiming the gala depended on it. The bank had reviewed his request and discovered something larger. For 18 months, he had been charging Madeline's travel, gifts, and private dinners to 3 Monroe accounts using household codes. Aaliyah looked toward the ballroom doors as guests began arriving. The black card had not merely paid for one stolen evening. It had been financing the affair from the beginning. The first person to realize Madeline Cross was not Mrs. Wellington was the boutique manager holding an unpaid diamond necklace beneath the cold light of a private fitting room. At 6:18, Madeline stood inside Beaumont Jewelers wearing the black beaded gown, one hand resting against the velvet counter while the associate attempted the card for a 4th time. The earrings had already been returned to their case. The necklace, valued at $42,000, remained fastened around her throat because the manager had not yet decided how politely to ask for it back. Outside the glass doors, 2 gala guests recognized her from foundation publicity photographs and slowed as they passed. There is no issue with the card, Madeline insisted. My husband's bank handles unusual limits all the time. The manager maintained the calm expression reserved for important clients and dangerous misunderstandings. The account holder placed a direct freeze, Ms. Cross. Charles Wellington is the account holder. No. The manager said gently. Dr. Aaliyah Monroe Wellington is. Madeline's face changed before she could control it. The distinction had always seemed ceremonial when Charles described their finances. He called the Monroe accounts family resources, the Gala a Wellington event, and Aaliyah's foundation an extension of his public brand. Now, beneath the boutique's white lights, every borrowed assumption had become a fact someone else could verify. Call Charles, she said. We already contacted his office. His card was unable to cover the remaining balance. The two women beyond the glass exchanged a look. Madeline reached behind her neck and removed the necklace with careful fingers. The manager accepted it, then asked for the earrings and the diamond bracelet still inside Madeline's garment bag. The gown had been paid in full before the freeze, but the final tailoring fee had not. Bellamy Couture called while she stood there, informing her that the boutique would send an invoice directly to her unless another payment method was provided by morning. This is humiliating, Madeline whispered when Charles finally arrived. He entered through the private door in a tuxedo, his jaw tight, his phone pressed against his palm. Keep your voice down. You told me the card was yours to use. It was available to me. That is not the same thing. We do not have time for this. He handed the manager a personal card for the tailoring fee and arranged a standard sedan after the chauffeured Bentley canceled. The decline at Beaumont could not be erased. The boutique staff had already logged the account dispute, and the foundation guests outside had carried the story toward the gala before Madeline left the fitting room. During the ride downtown, she stared at Charles without speaking. The black card rested inside her clutch, useless and suddenly heavy. Why did Aaliyah freeze it now, she asked. Charles looked out the window. She wants attention. She removed herself from the guest list. Because she wants me to ask her back. Madeline studied him. You said she would accept the separation. She will. Then why did the bank refuse to speak to you? He turned toward her. Because the account is technically hers. Technically. The Monroe office structures everything under trusts. It does not mean she controls the marriage. Madeline looked down at the card. For the first time, she wondered whether Charles had confused access with ownership in every part of his life. At the Metropolitan Grand, photographers gathered beneath the gold foundation crest. Charles stepped from the sedan first, then offered Madeline his hand. She emerged without the diamonds, without the Bentley, and without the calm confidence she had practiced. Whispers moved along the carpet before they reached the entrance. Inside, Aaliyah stood beside the donor wall in her midnight blue suit, greeting trustees by name. She did not look surprised to see them. She looked prepared. Charles crossed the marble floor toward her. Restore the card, he said beneath his breath. Madeline has been publicly embarrassed. Aaliyah's gaze moved to the black card visible inside Madeline's open clutch. She was embarrassed by using something that did not belong to her. Madeline stepped closer. You planned this. I protected my account. At the exact moment I needed it. You never needed my money. Before Charles could respond, Naomi Ellis approached with a sealed compliance report. She handed it to Aaliyah and spoke quietly. The 18 months of unauthorized charges totaled more than $2 million, but one transaction stood apart from dinners, hotels, and gifts. 3 months earlier, Charles had used Aaliyah's black card account as proof of liquidity to secure a private bridge loan for Wellington Capital. The loan was due at midnight after the gala, and without access to Monroe funds, his billionaire empire would default before morning. The black card Charles treated like a marital privilege had existed long before he became a billionaire, and its first purpose had never been luxury. Years earlier, before Wellington Capital occupied 40 floors above Manhattan, and before magazines called Charles a self-made visionary, Aaliyah Monroe carried that same card in a plain leather wallet while working 16-hour shifts at a community hospital in Harlem. She had inherited access to Monroe family office at 28, but her grandmother required every beneficiary to understand where the money came from and what it was meant to protect. The Monroe fortune had begun with pharmacies, medical supply contracts, and real estate purchased by a black family that learned early how quickly opportunity disappeared when banks changed their minds. The card was not a trophy. It was an emergency instrument connected to a private reserve designed to move quickly when institutions would not. Aaliyah used it first to cover hotel rooms for families whose children were receiving long-term treatment. Later, she used it to fund mobile clinics after a hurricane damaged rural communities in Louisiana. Every transaction was reviewed, documented, and tied to a purpose. Charles knew that history once. When they first met at a university fundraiser, he was charming without polish, ambitious without protection, and 3 months behind on the rent for his first office. Aaliyah liked that he spoke about building systems rather than collecting status. She introduced him to mentors, challenged his plans, and listened while he described the investment firm he hoped would one day finance companies ignored by traditional banks. He never asked how much money she had. She never asked how little remained in his account. Their early marriage took place in a courthouse with 12 guests and dinner at a family-owned restaurant in Brooklyn. Charles wore a navy suit he bought on sale. Aaliyah wore her mother's pearl earrings. At the time, he told her that being beside her made him feel wealthier than any balance sheet could. The memory returned now as she stood inside the Gala foyer, holding the compliance report that showed he had pledged her account to keep Wellington Capital alive. Charles remained beside her, unaware that Naomi Ellis had already identified the bridge loan. Madeline stood a few feet away, watching donors enter beneath the foundation crest. "We need to speak privately," Aaliyah said. Charles followed her into a small trustee lounge off the ballroom. Naomi entered behind them and closed the door. At midnight, Aaliyah said, "Wellington Capital owes $120 million to North Atlantic Private Credit." Charles's face changed. "That is confidential. You used Monroe family office as proof of liquidity. It was a temporary guarantee. You did not have authority to provide it." He looked toward Naomi. The bank accepted the documentation. Naomi placed a copy of the agreement on the table. The lender accepted a household certification submitted under Dr. Monroe Wellington's account profile. That certification was not signed by her. Charles's jaw tightened. "My office handled the paperwork. Your office used her black card number as evidence that Monroe funds stood behind the loan," Naomi replied. Madeline had entered before the door fully closed. "What happens if the payment fails?" she asked. Charles turned sharply. "This does not concern you. You used the same account you gave me." Aaliyah watched understanding move across Madeline's face. The gown, the jewelry, the hotel, and the Gala car had never been gifts from a limitless billionaire. They had been purchased from the reserve, keeping his empire upright. "The lender can seize pledged Wellington assets," Naomi said. "Several funds may enter technical default by morning." Charles looked at Aaliyah. "Release the account for one night." "No, you know what is at stake." "I know exactly what is at stake. That is why the account remains frozen." His voice dropped. "You would destroy my company over a personal disagreement?" Aaliyah met his eyes. "You endangered my family's assets to hide that your company was already failing." Charles glanced toward the ballroom doors as applause rose from the arriving crowd. For the first time, the billionaire name sounded less like power and more like a costume held together by borrowed credit. Naomi opened the final page of the loan file. The original certification had not come from Charles's assistant. It had been submitted from Madeline's foundation email, along with a request granting her future access to Monroe family office after the Gala. Aaliyah turned toward her. Madeline had not only spent the black card. She had been preparing to place herself inside the fortune behind it. Charles Wellington had built his billionaire reputation on the story that no one had ever rescued him. But Aaliyah still remembered every night she quietly kept his company alive. 12 years earlier, Wellington Capital was not a glass tower above Manhattan. It was 3 rented rooms in Midtown, 6 exhausted employees, and a founder who checked the company account before ordering lunch. Charles had talent, discipline, and the kind of confidence that made struggling people believe success was already inevitable. What he did not have was enough money to survive his first serious crisis. A software investment collapsed after its lead developer falsified revenue projections, leaving Wellington Capital responsible for nearly $40 million in obligations. Charles came home after midnight carrying a cardboard box from his office. He placed it beside the kitchen island and told Aaliyah he might have to close the firm by Friday. She listened while he described investors withdrawing, lenders refusing extensions, and employees who would lose their health insurance if payroll failed. He never asked her to save him. Pride would not allow it. Aaliyah waited until he fell asleep, then called Monroe family office. By sunrise, she had authorized a private rescue through 3 investment vehicles designed to conceal her identity. The money arrived as institutional capital, accompanied by strict performance conditions so Charles would believe he had earned the opportunity rather than received it through marriage. He did earn much of what followed. He worked relentlessly, rebuilt the failed portfolio, and expanded Wellington Capital into one of the most recognized investment firms in the country. But every major step rested on another quiet Monroe decision. When the firm entered private credit, Aaliyah guaranteed the first lending facility. When Charles acquired a distressed technology fund in California, her trust absorbed the risk no bank would accept. When a recession threatened hundreds of jobs, she released emergency capital on the condition that no employee earning under $100,000 would be laid off. Charles announced that decision as proof of his leadership. Aaliyah stood beside him at the press conference and said nothing. At first, her silence came from love. Later, it became protection. The more public Charles became, the more he needed to believe he was self-made. He removed her name from presentations, stopped mentioning the Monroe guarantees, and described her fortune as old family money, while presenting his own wealth as the result of superior judgment. Madeline helped turn that version into a brand. She arranged magazine profiles showing Charles alone in the first office, edited speeches to remove references to family backing, and trained him to answer questions about Aaliyah with polished gratitude instead of specifics. In the trustee lounge, Naomi Ellis placed the historical funding schedule beside the fraudulent bridge loan. The pages showed more than $800 million in direct capital, guarantees, and emergency reserves supplied by Monroe entities over 12 years. Madeline scanned the numbers, her expression shifting with each line. "You told me the Monroe money was ceremonial," she said to Charles. He did not look at her. "The company generated returns." "That is not what I asked." Aaliyah watched the space between them change. Madeline had believed she was attaching herself to a billionaire. Now she was discovering that the empire beneath his name had been financed by the wife she planned to replace. Charles turned toward Aaliyah. "You cannot claim the company because you invested in it. I am not claiming it." Aaliyah's voice remained steady. "I am identifying what you pledged without permission." Naomi opened the original capital agreement. It contained a protective covenant Charles had signed during the first rescue and never revisited. Any unauthorized use of Monroe assets triggered immediate conversion of the trust's preferred holdings into controlling voting shares. Charles stared at the clause, then at his own signature. Beneath it, "This cannot be active." It became active when Madeline submitted the false liquidity certification, Naomi said. The ballroom orchestra began its opening music beyond the closed doors. Guests were taking their seats, unaware that the billionaire scheduled to welcome them no longer controlled the company carrying his name. Aaliyah closed the file and stood. "You gave Madeline my black card because you believed my money belonged to you," she said. "Before this gala ends, both of you will learn exactly how much of your world was only borrowed." The gala had not been designed to introduce Madeline as Charles's companion. It had been designed to install her inside Aaliyah's foundation before anyone realized the authority was stolen. The orchestra softened as the ballroom doors opened, revealing 200 donors beneath crystal chandeliers and gold banners bearing the Wellington Foundation name. Charles stepped into the corridor first, adjusting his tuxedo as though posture could restore the control he had just lost. Madeline followed in the black beaded gown, carrying Aaliyah's frozen card inside her clutch. Without the borrowed diamonds, her neckline looked strangely bare, but she kept her chin high. Aaliyah walked behind them with Naomi Ellis and the Foundation's general counsel, calm enough that the arriving trustees assumed the evening was proceeding exactly as planned. At the entrance to the ballroom, Charles stopped her. "Whatever the documents say, do not embarrass us tonight." Aaliyah studied him. "You mean do not correct you in public?" "I mean protect the Foundation." "The Foundation is what I am protecting." Madeline glanced toward the stage, where a large screen displayed the evening program. Her name appeared beneath Charles's in gold lettering. Madeline Cross, incoming co-chair, Wellington Global Initiative. Aaliyah had seen no such title in the approved materials. "Who authorized that?" she asked. Madeline's hand tightened around her clutch. Charles answered. "The announcement was scheduled weeks ago. There is no Wellington Global Initiative. There will be after tonight." He lowered his voice. "It will combine the Foundation's international programs with Wellington Capital's Impact Division. Madeline will lead communications and donor strategy." Aaliyah looked toward the program table, where printed brochures carried the same announcement. On the final page, the Monroe Legacy Fund was described as a founding contributor, while control of all future campaigns appeared to rest with Charles and Madeline. Her family's foundation had been reduced to a footnote in a structure neither of them had authority to create. "You plan to transfer my programs into your company," Aaliyah said. Charles's expression remained controlled. "It is a strategic partnership. Using my donors, my staff, and my endowment. Using resources more effectively." Madeline stepped closer. "Aaliyah, the board needs someone visible. You avoid the press, skip dinners, and disappear into hospitals and grant reviews. Charles and I can modernize the brand." The words carried more than ambition. They carried the confidence of a woman who had already imagined herself seated in Aaliyah's office, answering Aaliyah's phone, and signing Aaliyah's name beneath a new logo. "Does the board know?" Aaliyah asked. Charles looked toward the ballroom. "They will after the presentation." That was the trap. The announcement would happen in front of donors, reporters, and institutional partners. Once applause began, objecting publicly could be framed as instability. Charles expected embarrassment to force Aaliyah into silence. He had used the same method at home, making every challenge feel too inconvenient, too emotional, or too public to pursue. But this was not their dining room. This room belonged to contracts, bylaws, and money he had never controlled. Aaliyah walked to the event director and asked for the full presentation file. The woman handed her a tablet. Slide after slide showed Madeline beside Charles, introducing a 5-year expansion funded by $150 million from the Monroe Legacy Fund. The final slide listed Charles as founder and Madeline as executive co-chair. Aaliyah's name appeared only under special thanks. Naomi examined the metadata. This file was uploaded from Madeline's office yesterday. The general counsel opened the attached authorization. It carried Aaliyah's digital signature. "This is not yours," he said quietly. Madeline's composure faltered. Charles looked at her. "You told me Aaliyah approved the transfer. You told me she would not fight it. That is not an answer." The orchestra ended, and the master of ceremonies approached the microphone. Charles's pre-recorded introduction began playing through the ballroom speakers, praising Madeline as the woman who would lead the foundation into its next era. Guests turned toward the stage. Aaliyah did not stop the video. She instructed the technician to let every word play. Then she handed him the revised program containing her live ownership announcement. Before Charles could reach the microphone, the foundation's bank president arrived with an emergency notice. The forged co-chair authorization had triggered a full governance lock, freezing every foundation account except those controlled directly by Aaliyah. The gala could continue, but Charles and Madeline no longer had access to a single dollar in the room. The moment Charles stepped onto the stage, Aaliyah understood that his greatest weakness was not betrayal. It was his certainty that a crowded room would make her too polite to stop him. The ballroom lights dimmed as the final image of the pre-recorded introduction faded from the screen. Applause rose beneath the chandeliers, warm and automatic, directed toward a future no one in the room had yet examined. Charles walked to the microphone with Madeline beside him, her black gown catching the gold light as she smiled toward donors, reporters, and trustees. From a distance, they looked composed. Only Aaliyah knew the black card inside Madeline's clutch was frozen. The foundation accounts beneath Charles's speech were locked, and the digital signature authorizing their new initiative had already been identified as false. Charles placed one hand on the podium. "Tonight marks the beginning of a new chapter," he said. His voice carried the practiced confidence that had once made investors trust him before the numbers justified it. For years, this foundation has served communities across the country. Now, under the Wellington Global Initiative, we will expand that mission around the world. Aaliyah remained near the side of the stage with Naomi Ellis and the General Counsel. She could have interrupted him immediately. Instead, she listened. Charles thanked donors, praised Wellington Capital, and described Madeline as the visionary leader who will guide our next era of impact. Madeline stepped forward when he invited her to speak. "This foundation has always represented generosity," she said. "But generosity must evolve. We will bring new visibility, new partnerships, and new discipline to every dollar entrusted to us." The word entrusted moved through Aaliyah like cold air. Madeline had used her card, forged her approval, and attempted to claim her foundation, yet she still spoke as if stewardship belonged to whoever stood closest to the microphone. On the screen behind them, The final slide appeared. Charles Wellington, founder. Madeline Cross, executive co-chair. The Monroe Legacy Fund, founding contributor. Aaliyah's name was missing. Several longtime trustees shifted in their seats. One elderly donor leaned toward his wife and whispered something while studying the program. Charles saw the uncertainty and moved quickly. Madeline and I are honored to accept responsibility for this extraordinary institution. That was the sentence Aaliyah had been waiting for. She walked onto the stage. The applause faltered, then stopped. Charles turned toward her with a smile meant for cameras. "Aaliyah," he said quietly, "this is not the time." She approached the second microphone. "Actually, it is the only appropriate time." Madeline's fingers tightened around her clutch. Charles lowered his voice. "Do not make this personal." Aaliyah looked across the ballroom. "The work of this foundation has never been personal property. That is precisely why tonight's announcement requires clarification." The general counsel signaled the technician. The false presentation disappeared. In its place appeared the original charter of the Monroe Legacy Fund, dated 21 years earlier, followed by the current governance record. Aaliyah's full legal name was listed as sole controlling chair. Charles appeared only as honorary co-chair, without authority to appoint officers, transfer programs, or access endowment funds. Madeline's name appeared nowhere. A murmur moved across the room. "The Wellington Global Initiative has no legal existence," Aaliyah said. "No board vote authorized it. No valid signature approved it. No foundation assets have been transferred." Charles stepped closer. "We discussed this privately." "You discussed taking it privately." She turned toward the audience again. "Earlier this evening, a forged authorization triggered a governance lock. Every foundation account remains secure, every grant remains funded, and tonight's charitable commitments will continue exactly as promised." Donors began looking from Charles to Madeline with a new kind of attention. Madeline lifted her chin. "This is a misunderstanding." Naomi walked onto the stage carrying the bank's emergency notice. "It is not," she said. "The signature used to appoint Ms. Cross was submitted from her foundation email and verified through a device registered to Mr. Wellington." Charles stared at Madeline. "You told me Aaliyah signed it." Madeline's expression hardened. "You told me she would never challenge us publicly." The microphones caught every word. No one in the ballroom moved. Aaliyah let the silence reveal what anger never could. Then the foundation president approached with a second sealed document. The forged transfer had activated a protective clause in the Monroe Trust. Effective immediately, Charles's honorary position was suspended, his access to all charitable accounts was revoked, and every pending partnership tied to Wellington Capital required Aaliyah's sole approval. She opened the document and found one final provision Charles had forgotten. Because he had used foundation assets to support his private bridge loan, the trust now held the legal right to seize control of Wellington Capital before midnight. The billionaire who had ordered Aaliyah away from her own gala now stood beneath her foundation's crest, waiting to learn whether she would save the empire he had built with her money. The ballroom remained silent after the final provision appeared on the screen. Charles stared at the words granting the Monroe Trust immediate control of Wellington Capital if the bridge loan defaulted at midnight. Behind him, Madeline's name still glowed faintly on the abandoned presentation slide, a title attached to an initiative that had never legally existed. Aaliyah stood at the microphone without triumph. She could hear the soft movement of programs being folded, the whisper of silk against chairs, and the distant clink of glassware from servers who had paused along the walls. The donors were no longer watching a gala. They were watching a man discover that the fortune carrying his surname had always rested on his wife's consent. Charles moved closer to Aaliyah. "We need 10 minutes in private." "The foundation's governance is not private," she replied. "Neither is the forged authorization." His face tightened. "If Wellington Capital defaults tonight, thousands of employees will be affected. That is why the trust has already prepared a continuity plan." The foundation president handed her a second folder. Inside was an emergency conversion agreement drafted by Monroe Family Office. If signed before midnight, the trust would satisfy the bridge loan, stabilize payroll, and prevent lenders from breaking the company apart. In return, Charles would surrender executive control, voting authority, and any right to use Monroe assets without written approval. Aaliyah had not created the agreement to rescue his reputation. She had created it to protect the people whose livelihoods he had placed beneath his pride. You prepared this before tonight, Charles said. I prepared it after learning you had pledged my family's money without consent. Then sign it, Madeline said sharply. Charles turned toward her. This is my company. It will not be your company in 3 hours if she does nothing. Her voice carried across the microphone again, and several guests looked away in discomfort. Madeline noticed too late. She lowered her tone. Charles, say what you can. He studied her as though hearing the calculation beneath every promise for the first time. You submitted the false certification, he said. Because you told me Aaliyah would eventually approve it. I told you she trusted me. No, you told me she would never know. Their alliance began to fracture in full view of the room. Aaliyah stepped away from the microphone and addressed the guests. Tonight's charitable program will continue. Every pledge will go directly to the hospitals, scholarships, and housing programs listed in your materials. The governance matter will be handled by the trust and independent counsel. The assurance changed the room. Donors who had arrived expecting Charles's performance now turned toward Aaliyah with visible respect. She had not canceled the evening, exposed private details for spectacle, or placed beneficiaries at risk. She had separated consequence from chaos. The orchestra resumed quietly as dinner service began. Charles, Madeline, Aaliyah, Naomi, and the general counsel entered a private conference room behind the stage. On the table waited the conversion agreement and a digital clock showing 9:14 p.m. Charles read the first pages in silence. Wellington Capital would remain operational, but the board would be reconstituted. His compensation would be suspended during the investigation. Every related party expense would be audited. The Monroe Trust would hold 51% of voting control until all unauthorized obligations were resolved. You are taking my company, he said. Aaliyah sat across from him. I am preventing your lenders from taking it. You knew this clause existed. You signed it. Madeline reached for the agreement, but Naomi closed the folder before she could touch it. Ms. Cross has no standing in this transaction. Madeline's face hardened. I am the company's communications director. Your employment is now under review, the general counsel said. So are 18 months of charges linked to Dr. Monroe Wellington's accounts. Charles looked at Madeline. How much did you spend? She said nothing. Naomi placed the compliance ledger between them. Hotels, jewelry, private flights, dinners, spa reservations, and luxury purchases totaled $2,300,000. Several charges had been categorized as donor cultivation, despite involving no donors at all. Charles stared at the pages, then at the black card visible inside Madeline's clutch. Give it back, he said. Madeline looked toward Aaliyah instead. For the first time that evening, there was no confidence in her face, only the realization that the card had never represented Charles's devotion. It represented access to a woman he had underestimated. She removed it and placed it on the table. Aaliyah did not reach for it. At 11:47 p.m., Charles signed the conversion agreement. Naomi immediately authorized payment of the bridge loan, protecting the company from default. Then the general counsel opened the final attachment. The audit had uncovered a draft amendment naming Madeline as beneficiary of a private Wellington trust after the divorce. But the trust held no independent assets. Every dollar inside it came from Monroe guarantees, meaning the moment Charles signed away control, Madeline's promised fortune vanished with his authority. The woman Charles promised a billionaire's future finally understood that he had never owned the card, the fortune, or the power he used to impress her. The digital clock passed midnight inside the private conference room while the gala continued beyond the closed doors. Charles's signature rested at the bottom of the conversion agreement, transferring controlling authority over Wellington Capital to the Monroe Trust. Naomi Ellis confirmed the bridge loan had been paid, employee accounts were protected, and every lender had received notice that operations would continue under independent supervision. The company survived, but the story Charles told about owning it did not. Madeline stared at the draft trust amendment that had once promised her a fortune after his divorce. Without Monroe guarantees, it held no property, no investments, and no cash reserves. It was a beautiful document wrapped around nothing. You said the trust was worth $200 million, she told Charles. That was the projected value after restructuring. You said it already existed. It did exist. Empty. The word left her mouth quietly, but it carried more contempt than anger. Charles looked toward Aaliyah. You knew the Wellington Trust depended on Monroe assets. I knew because my office funded every account inside it. Aaliyah's voice remained steady. You knew because you signed the guarantees. Madeline pulled the black card from the table and held it between two fingers. Then what exactly was this? Naomi opened the account registry on her tablet. A private charge instrument issued solely to Dr. Aaliyah Monroe Wellington through Monroe Family Office. She turned the screen toward them. The ownership line displayed Aaliyah's name, followed by the original issue date, 7 years before Charles became eligible for auxiliary access. Mr. Wellington was added as a restricted household user, Naomi continued. He had permission for approved travel, medical emergencies, and joint foundation expenses. He never had authority to add another user. Charles leaned back in his chair. The bank accepted my request. A representative processed it based on false information, Naomi said. The recording shows you identified Ms. Cross as your wife and household representative. Madeline looked at him. You lied to the bank. I simplified the request. You gave me a card you were not allowed to give. You used it willingly. The accusation exposed the last fragile thread between them. Madeline's eyes narrowed. Because you told me it was yours. Charles said nothing. The bank president entered a moment later with 2 compliance officers and a sealed statement prepared for the foundation board. He apologized directly to Aaliyah for the authorization failure and confirmed that the bank would reverse all disputed charges, pursue recovery from the unauthorized users, and permanently remove Charles from Monroe accounts. Effective immediately, he said, Mr. Wellington has no access to Dr. Monroe Wellington's private banking relationships. Ms. Cross never had legal access at all. Madeline lowered the card onto the table. The sound was almost weightless. A few hours earlier, it had opened hotel suites, boutiques, cars, and private rooms. Now it was only a thin piece of metal bearing another woman's authority. What happens to the purchases? She asked. Items that can be returned will be returned, Naomi said. Other charges will be assigned to you personally or included in the company's recovery claim. Madeline looked down at the gown she was wearing, even that had been purchased before the freeze through Aaliyah's account. Do I have to return this too? Aaliyah met her gaze. No. Keep it. Madeline seemed startled. Why? Because every time you wear it, you will remember who paid for the evening you thought belonged to you. Charles closed his eyes briefly. The sentence did not humiliate Madeline as loudly as shouting would have. It simply left nowhere for illusion to hide. The general counsel then placed divorce documents before Aaliyah. Charles had prepared them days earlier, offering her a settlement funded through assets he no longer controlled. Attached was a clause requiring her to waive all claims against Wellington Capital and the foundation. Aaliyah read it once. You plan to remove me from the Gala, use my card to dress Madeline, and have me sign away the company afterward. Charles looked at the floor. I believed the company was mine. That belief was the problem. She closed the folder and handed it back and signed. Then Naomi received an alert from the bank's forensic team. The black card charges had revealed one final account Charles never disclosed. A private escrow containing Gala donations redirected under Madeline's new initiative. The money had not yet moved, but the transfer instructions were scheduled for dawn, proving that the frozen card had stopped more than a shopping spree. It had interrupted the final step in taking Aaliyah's foundation from her. The frozen black card had exposed the affair, but the hidden escrow proved Charles and Madeline had been preparing to steal something far greater than a place at the Gala. At 12:19 a.m., Naomi Ellis projected the escrow records onto the conference room screen. The account had been opened 3 weeks earlier under the name Wellington Global Initiative, the same organization Charles and Madeline had attempted to announce from the stage. More than $14 million in donor pledges were scheduled to move at 6 the next morning. The transfer would have redirected funds away from the Monroe Legacy Fund and placed them under a board controlled by Charles, with Madeline listed as executive director and authorized signatory. Aaliyah studied the signatures attached to the account opening documents. Her name appeared beneath every page, but the handwriting was digital, copied from an old foundation grant. They used my approval again, she said. The bank president nodded. The authorization originated from Ms. Cross's office, but it was verified through Mr. Wellington's executive credentials. Charles turned toward Madeline. You told me the escrow would remain inactive until after the board voted. You told me the board would follow your recommendation. There was no board vote. There would have been once the announcement became public. Her answer revealed the plan with brutal simplicity. They intended to use the Gala's applause as pressure, making the transfer seem inevitable before anyone examined the paperwork. Aaliyah closed the account file. Cancel the transfer. Naomi entered the command. The pending transaction disappeared from the screen, and the $14 million returned to the Monroe Legacy Fund's protected donor account. Charles watched without speaking. Madeline's face tightened. Those donors pledged because of the Wellington name. Aaliyah looked at her. They pledged to hospitals, housing programs, and scholarships, not to your title. You cannot erase my work. I am separating your work from the money you tried to control. The General Counsel placed 2 additional documents on the table. The first terminated Madeline's employment for submitting false authorizations, misclassifying private expenses, and attempting to redirect charitable funds. The second suspended Charles from every foundation position and initiated a formal review of his conduct at Wellington Capital. Neither document mentioned the affair. The consequences came from what they had done with authority, not from whom they had betrayed in private. Madeline read the termination letter slowly. You are firing me in the middle of the gala. Your access ended when you tried to move donor money before dawn, Aaliyah said. You may leave with counsel, or you may return to the ballroom as a guest until the program concludes. You will not speak for the foundation again. Madeline looked at Charles, expecting him to intervene. He remained seated, stripped of the confidence he had carried into the evening. Say something, she demanded. What do you want me to say? That we built this together. Charles stared at the empty trust amendment, the returned escrow funds, and the black card lying between them. We built nothing, he said quietly. We borrowed access and called it power. Madeline's expression hardened. Do not pretend you are innocent because she saved your company. I am not innocent. For the first time, Charles spoke without defending himself. But I finally understand what you wanted. And what was that? Not me. Proximity to whatever Aaliyah owned. Madeline laughed once, without warmth. You wanted the same thing. The truth left both of them silent. Aaliyah gathered the divorce documents and stood. The gala continues for another hour. After that, the board will issue a statement confirming that all donor funds are secure. Charles looked up. What happens to Wellington Capital now? The Monroe Trust will stabilize it, replace the executive committee, and protect employees from the consequences of your choices. And me? You will have no operational authority during the investigation. Our marriage. Aaliyah placed the unsigned settlement on the table. Your attorney will receive my terms Monday morning. She walked back into the ballroom alone. The orchestra played softly, dinner service continued, and donors spoke with relief after learning their pledges remained intact. Aaliyah took the stage near 1 in the morning and announced that the $14 million would fund emergency housing, community clinics, and legal support for women facing financial control inside marriage. She never mentioned Charles or Madeline by name. She did not need to. At the close of the program, Naomi handed her the final reconciliation report. The black card had been frozen at 5:45 p.m. If Aaliyah had waited until after the gala, the escrow transfer would have cleared at dawn, placing her foundation beyond immediate recovery. The card Charles gave his mistress had not merely revealed his betrayal. Freezing it had stopped them from taking the legacy Aaliyah's family spent generations building. By the time the ballroom emptied, Charles finally understood that Aaliyah had not frozen a card to embarrass his mistress. She had frozen the door before they could carry away her family's legacy. Dawn was beginning to soften the Manhattan skyline when Aaliyah returned to the Metropolitan Grand's empty ballroom. The chandeliers still glowed above half-cleared tables, and the gold foundation crest reflected across the polished floor. Staff moved quietly between chairs, collecting programs and untouched glasses. Hours earlier, Charles had stood on that stage believing his name controlled everything in the room. Madeline had arrived wearing an $85,000 gown purchased through Aaliyah's account, certain that borrowed luxury meant she had already replaced its owner. Now the false initiative had been dissolved, $14 million in donor funds had been secured, and every account connected to the Monroe Legacy Fund answered only to Aaliyah. Naomi Ellis approached carrying a slim black folder. The final reversals are complete, she said. All disputed charges have been removed from your account. Charles's auxiliary privileges are permanently revoked. Madeline's purchases will be recovered through the settlement. Aaliyah signed the confirmation without looking toward the black card resting inside the evidence envelope. It no longer represented betrayal. It represented the moment she stopped allowing love to disguise financial control. 3 months later, the divorce was finalized in a quiet Manhattan courtroom. Charles accepted a settlement limited to assets he had earned independently of Monroe guarantees. He surrendered all voting authority in Wellington Capital, resigned from the foundation, and agreed to repay the personal expenses hidden inside corporate accounts. The company survived under a new board, but the first page of its annual report carried a disclosure Charles could no longer rewrite. Monroe family office had provided the capital that built and protected it. Madeline left the firm before the internal investigation concluded. The gown was the only Gala purchase she kept, because Aaliyah had refused to request its return. Photographs from that night followed Madeline through every attempt to rebuild her career, not because she had looked beautiful, but because the woman beside Charles had been introduced as a leader of a foundation she never controlled. The image became a permanent reminder that appearance could imitate power only until the records were opened. Aaliyah made no public statement about the affair. Instead, she renamed the annual event the Monroe Legacy Gala and redirected the recovered funds into a national financial independence program for women. The program offered emergency housing, legal support, banking education, and confidential assistance to spouses whose partners used money as leverage. On opening day, Aaliyah stood inside a bright community center in Harlem, only a few blocks from the hospital where she had once worked overnight shifts. Women sat at long tables learning how to read credit reports, protect inherited assets, and identify unauthorized debt. No cameras were invited. No names were placed above the doors except those of the women in Aaliyah's family who built the fortune across generations. Charles asked to see her once after the divorce. They met in a quiet cafe near Central Park, far from the penthouse, the Gala, and the offices where he had once mistaken access for ownership. He looked older without the polished machinery of his public image around him. "I thought giving Madeline the card was a small thing," he said. Aaliyah stirred her coffee slowly. "That was why it mattered. I did not understand what it represented. You understood it belonged to me." He looked down. "I believed marriage made it ours. Marriage made trust ours. It did not make my identity transferable." Charles nodded, unable to argue. "Do you hate me?" Aaliyah looked through the window at people crossing the avenue beneath the morning sun. "No. Hate would require me to keep carrying you." She stood and placed enough cash beside her cup to cover both orders. Charles watched her lift her coat. "Aaliyah," he said, "what would you have done if I had asked instead of taking it?" She paused. "I would have listened." Then she met his eyes with the calm he once mistook for weakness. "But you did not give her my power, Charles. You only showed me you were never worthy of sharing it." She walked outside, leaving him with the empty chair, while the foundation, the company, and the life behind the black card moved forward under the name of the woman who had owned them all along.